Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In his Nobel lecture on literature entitled Beauty Will Save the World, the great Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said the following words. So perhaps that ancient trinity of truth, goodness, and beauty is not simply an empty, faded formula as we thought in the days of our self-confident, materialistic youth. If the tops of these three trees converge, as the scholars maintained, but the too blatant, too direct stems of truth and goodness are crushed, cut down, not allowed through, then perhaps the fantastic, unpredictable, unexpected stems of beauty will push through and soar to that very same place, and in so doing will fulfill the work of all three. In that case, Dostoevsky's remark, "Beauty will save the world," was not a careless phrase, but a prophecy. Resounding at the height of the Cold War, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's words here served as an invitation to the world order of his day to reconsider the nature of reality in a way radically different from the coercion and manipulation inherent in political power. These words were a summons for the Soviet East and the ostensibly democratic West to remember an identity that both civilizations had once shared, but which had, in the course of the 20th century, been eclipsed by secular statism. Solzhenitsyn's speech was a call for the world to return to beauty, the effulgent or illuminative manifestation of the loveliness, the delectableness, the delightfulness of the true and the good. Because it is here, in the splendor of beauty, that all our ideological abstractions are relativized by a sense of the sacred, which lifts us up or helps lift us up into an indissoluble union with the divine source of life. And it was this that for Solzhenitsyn formed the redeeming nature of art, through which, regardless of the secular eclipse of truth and goodness, beauty still shines for all to see. Now, the idea that beauty serves as an invitation is not new. It has long been recognized that the classical Greek word for beauty, kalos, is related etymologically to the verb kalein, meaning to call. However, if we are to accept such an invitation, then we are going to have to familiarize ourselves with concepts, vocabulary, and frames of reference that have been largely lost underneath the opposite of the truth, the good, and the beautiful, that is, underneath the colossus of lies, evil, and ugliness that constitutes the modern world. Accordingly, it is precisely within this context of invitation that I have designed this series of lectures on the history and tradition of classical education from the ancient Greeks on down to our own day, examining the origins of this tradition, charting its developments and transformations, and parsing its modern abandonment. To begin with, I would like to make some preliminary remarks of a general character. Every nation which has reached a certain stage of development is instinctively impelled to practice education. Education we can define as the process by which a community preserves and transmits its physical and intellectual character. The natural process of transmission from one generation to another ensures the perpetuation of the physical characteristics even of animals, but of humans, of course, as well. But humans can transmit their social and intellectual nature only by exercising the qualities through which these things were created, namely reason and conscious will. Through the exercise of these two qualities, man commands a freedom of development which is impossible to other living creatures. And by deliberate training, the physical nature of the human race, yes, can be developed and can acquire a higher range of abilities, but the human mind has infinitely richer potentialities of development. As man becomes increasingly aware of his own powers, he strives by learning more of the two worlds, that is, the world outside himself and the world inside himself, to create for himself the best kind of life. Humanity's unique nature, combining as it does body and mind, creates special conditions governing the maintenance and transmission of the human type, and imposes on humanity a special set of formative processes, both physical and mental. Collectively, we denote these processes as a whole by the name education. Education, thus practiced by human beings, is inspired by the same creative and directive vital force which impels every species of nature to maintain and preserve its own type, but it is raised to a far higher power by the deliberate effort of human knowledge and human will to attain a known end. Now, from these facts, certain general conclusions follow. To begin with, education is not a practice of the individual alone. It is essentially a function of the community, as expressed in individuals who compose it. And for man, the zoon politikon, as Aristotle called us, or a creature who lives in a political community, the community is the source of all behavior. The formative influence of the community on its members is most constantly active in its deliberate endeavor to educate each new generation of individuals so as to make them in its own image. The structure of every society is based on the written and unwritten laws which bind it and its members. Therefore, education in any human community, be it a family, a social class, a profession, or some wider complex or group such as a nation or race, education understood in these lights is the direct expression of that community's active awareness of a standard towards which it molds its younger generations. Now, education keeps pace with life, the life and growth of the community, and is altered both by changes imposed from the outside and by transformations in its internal structure and development from within. And since the basis of education is a general consciousness of the values which govern human life, its history is affected by changes in the values current within any given community. In general, when these values are stable, education itself is firmly based. Yet when these are displaced or destroyed, the educational process is weakened until it becomes inoperative. And this occurs whenever tradition is violently overthrown or suffers internal collapse, as in our own contemporary society. Indeed, we see this in particular in our own society, where in so many respects, contemporary society is envisioned as a rejection and a denial of the traditional categories which have traditionally defined Western civilization religiously, culturally, and politically. And yet, it is precisely in this time of cultural upheaval and deracination, uprooting, that we must look to the roots of our culture, to the two well springs from where our civilization has come, namely the Greco-Roman classics and Christianity. These two things form the double helix of the DNA of the West, and they are inextricably linked to every great achievement that the West has created over the past 2,000 years. Beginning with the first of these, Greece is in a special category. However highly we may value the artistic, religious, and political achievements of earlier nations, say those of Egypt or Babylon, nevertheless, the history of what we can truly call culture as the deliberate pursuit of an ideal does not begin until Greece. In the last 150 years or so, modern scholarship has immensely extended the history of our knowledge of our appreciation for the horizon of history. The oikumene, or inhabited world, known to the Greeks and Romans, which for 2,000 years was believed to be coterminous with the entire Earth, has shrunk now to a narrow section at its center, and hitherto unexplored intellectual domains have been open to our view, say, of South America, Africa, and Asia. Yet it is even clearer today, after all of this anthropological exploration, that this expansion of our intellectual horizon has not altered the central fact that, insofar as it is not the history of only one particular nation, but of a group of nations to which we belong, both genetically and intellectually, our history, Western history, still begins with the Greeks. And by begins, I mean not only the temporal commencement of our culture, but also the arche, as it is called in Greek, the intellectual source or origin to which, of our culture. And as we reach every new age of development, we must constantly revert back to this arche, this source, to reorient ourselves. And this is why throughout our history we always return to Greece. Yet our return to Greece and our spontaneous renewal of this influence does not mean that by acknowledging the timeless and ever-present intellectual greatness of the Greeks, we have given them an authority over us which we must slavishly copy. They themselves would resist such tyranny. But what it means is that when we say that our history begins with the Greeks, we, first of all, must be sure of the meaning to which we attach the word history. History may connote the exploration of foreign, half-understood new worlds. Today, we have a keener perception, no doubt, of the morphology of human life and all of its permutations, studying even the remotest people, say in Papua New Guinea, with closer attention, and we can try to enter into their culture and to their minds. But history in this anthropological sense must be distinguished from history which is based on a true and active mental kinship, whether within one nation or within a group of nations. Only in this type of history is it possible to achieve true understanding of the inner nature of a people or an epoch and a creative contact between the observer and the observed. Only through this type of history can we realize our common fund of mature social and intellectual forms and ideals, regardless of the manifold variations and interpretations, the blends and conflicts, the disappearances and rebirths which these forms and ideals must undergo among the many different ethnic groups which make up the one family of European nations. Such a community of forms and ideals exists in a special sense between Greece and Rome on the one hand, and the great modern nations of the West, individually and collectively on the other. If we accept this deeper conception of history as expressing a community of origin and ideals, we must admit that however widely our anthropological horizon may be extended, the frontiers of our history can never recede beyond those which, for the past 3,000 years, have been bounded by the historical destiny of the European nations, beginning with Greece. Now, the revolutionary epic-making position held by the Greeks in the history of education, of course, cannot be explained in a few sentences. And so the purpose of this course, especially in its first few lectures, is to give an account of their intellectual culture, their paideia, meaning enculturation, a word that usually gets translated as education, but it means more like education and culture combined, and to describe its particular character and its historical development. We will begin with Homer, then examine the Sophists, as well as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But then we will shift, because the facts of Greek history would have long ago sunk into oblivion if the Greeks had not molded them into a permanent form and then passed them on to another culture. At the earliest stage of their development, they had no clear conception of the nature of this act of will, which is education. But as they moved into ever clearer vision of what education entails, and as they moved along their historical path, the ever-present aim of their life came to be more and more vividly defined. It was the creation of a higher type of human being. They believed that education embodied the purpose of all human effort. It was, they held, the ultimate justification for the existence of both the individual and the community. And at the summit of their development, that was how they interpreted their own the nature of the educational task. It was indeed ultimately in the form of paideia, enculturation, that the Greeks bequeathed the whole achievement of the Hellenic mind to the other nations of antiquity. The Roman Emperor Augustus envisioned the task of the Roman Empire in terms of this humanizing effort of Greek paideia to impose custom upon peace, as Virgil put it, paciquim pone remorem. Without Greek culture and its ideals, Greco-Roman civilization would not have been a historical unity, and the culture of the West would have never come into existence. Accordingly, we will turn our attention to the first moment of transformation of the ancient Greek model of education, to the Romans, and explore their adaptations of the Greek educational ideal in the writings of Cicero, Quintilian, and Seneca the Younger. Then we will explore how this Greco-Roman model of education underwent a further, even more fundamental development under the influence of Christianity, wherein the old model, which sought to cultivate in students a particular kind of humane life that embodied truth, goodness, and beauty, now showed that that kind of transformation begins at the fountain of worship and flows out into unlimited cultural pursuits which awaken the divinely imparted meaning of the cosmos and thereby voice creation's praise. The distinctly Christian transformation of classical education would form an invitation to cultivate a life of human flourishing, and thus to a living testimony that Christ indeed is risen, and that God's inextinguishable love has in fact broken into our world, redeeming and sanctifying the world and the senses, and which collectively, even now, celebrate and anticipate the divine renewal of all things. We will explore this aspect of the classical model in education from the time of the Greek and Latin church fathers throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, with lectures devoted to each of those periods. Finally, we will parse how this model of shaping humanity through a distinctly Christian educational project came to be challenged from the time of the French Enlightenment and ultimately discarded in our own times. That is the general outline of our course. Now, I have used the word culture many times so far, and we are accustomed to use this word not to describe an ideal, which is the Greek sense, but in a much more trivial and general sense. We speak of subway culture versus bus culture. We speak about the culture of a particular workplace, or even the culture of primitive tribes. That is, we use the term culture for the entire complex of ways and expressions of life which characterize any given nation. And in this way, the word has sunk down to mean a simple anthropological concept, not a concept of value, a consciously pursued ideal. You see, the word cultura in Latin means cultivation. Agricultura, the cultivation of a field. That is, to take something that, if it were left on its own, would just simply become wild and unfruitful, and only through conscious effort towards a particular goal and standard to make it into something that is beautiful and good and fruitful. Yet, in an age in which, in many respects, is tired of civilization, and which seeks to embrace decadence, vulgarity, and moral relativism, such as ours, it seems, in fact, that the culture of the present cannot impart any value at all to the original Greek form of culture, but rather needs illumination and transformation by that ideal in order to reestablish its true meaning and direction. And this realization of and return to the archetype implies a mental attitude closely akin to that of the Greeks themselves. This, of course, serves as a ready response to those who may ask you, why study the Greeks? Why study the Greek and Latin languages? Why study the classics in general? For many, the classics are useless. Now, I won't enter into a discussion on the meaning of utility, which is a concept with so many variations and stratifications that have been centuries in the making, that such a discussion merits an entire course on its own. But what I will say here, however, is that those many people, the noisy set of bankers, school teachers, parents, and professionals in every field, who say, why study the classics? They have a sadly, and I would even say dangerously limited idea of education and human development. What their focus on usefulness betrays is the belief that in the end, knowledge simply amounts to know-how, that thought should be immediately adapted toward a practical aim. But if that were the case, then knowledge would hardly be useful. We would have surgeons and plumbers, but not much else, given that machines are growing more and more responsible for satisfying our primary needs. Eventually, the surgeon or plumber will disappear too, no doubt. And if such is the fate of knowledge, then that it all has to be surrendered to machines, or as we put it nowadays, more likely to technology and artificial intelligence, what then exactly will there be for humans to know? Of course, we'll have to learn how to build the machines and keep them functioning and dispose of the remains when they become obsolete, but and how to build better machines. But in short, if that were it, all would be in service of machines, with the idea that no doubt that the machines are what is truly fundamental, the only really useful thing, and the all-encompassing solution to our problems. But what about the rest? what about those needs that aren't immediate, that aren't practical or distinctly material, and yet are no less urgent? That is to say, what about the mind, memory, imagination, creativity, depth, complexity? What about the larger questions, which are common to other essential domains of knowledge, like biology, physics, philosophy, psychology, and art? Where and when did it all begin? Where do I go after I die? Who am I? Who are others? What is society? What is history? What is time? What is language? What are words? What is human life? What are feelings? Who is a stranger to me? Who is a friend? What am I doing here? What am I saying when I speak? What am I thinking when I think? What is meaning? All of this we might call questions of interpretation. Because without interpretation, there is no freedom. There is simply instinct and hunger. And without freedom, there is no happiness. All of this kind of behavior leads to exactly what we see nowadays: passivity and a tacit acceptance of even our brighter moods. One becomes a slave to screens, to political jargon, to the market, driven on by false needs. And indeed, there is a great tribe of people out there looking to manipulate us based around our desires that have been indeed implanted in us. And I would like to show you now a very interesting short clip from a film all about how that began in the early part of the 20th century.
This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today. Human beings with dangerous instinctual drives. Freud had devised a method he called psychoanalysis. By analyzing dreams and free association, he had unearthed, he said, powerful sexual and aggressive forces, which were the remnants of our animal past. Feelings we repressed because they were too dangerous.
Freud devised a method for exploring a hidden part of the mind, which we nowadays call the unconscious, which is a part that is totally unknown to our consciousness, that there exists a barrier in all our minds which prevents these hidden and unwelcome impulses of the unconscious from emerging. Good night.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire led Europe into war. As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings. The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave, from our knowledge of psychoanalysis. Governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward Bernays, was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea, both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the President to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 1926, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came. And Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Now, this documentary goes on for another 4 hours, and I would definitely recommend that you look into it. Century of the Self. You can see it on YouTube. But I just want to talk a little bit about what the implications of this are, because this man, Edward Bernays, that most of you, I'm sure, have never heard of, most people have never heard of, has had such an enormous impact on the way that we are all shaped by our society. He went on to have an enormous career with the government. Whenever the CIA was busy toppling regimes in South America or Central America or elsewhere in the world, it was always Bernays who was at the head of the propaganda wing of that, for things like Operation Mockingbird, the manipulation of domestic media in America, which of course still persists to this day. And think about that. Mark well on that, how he and he gave birth to an entire new way of how our culture manipulates us by putting desires and thoughts into our minds, which were not there, such that we want to do things, and we think that we're being repressed if we don't have the freedom to do those things, when in reality, those desires have been put there by somebody who wants to manipulate us. Mark that well, and listen to a couple of his words. This is from his book in 1928 called Propaganda. He says the following thing: the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government. Look at those. This group of people who creates and manipulates information and the habits of people, the opinions of people. This constitutes an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Amazing words. And he would know it. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. And if we just skip down to the other boldface type words, whatever attitude one chooses to take towards this condition, whether like it or not, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our special conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction of our 120 million. That would have been the population of America back in those days. Obviously, it's 330 now, but who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. Think well on that, my friends. That, and he was far from the only one. This is taken for granted, of course, in advertising, but it is especially used in politics and by all of the social influencers of our society. Another book that you should look into is by a man named Walter Lippmann, who also wrote a book called Propaganda, in which he has, I'm sorry, Public Opinion is the name of his book, in which he said, he has some quotes here that you can read for yourself on the screen. This, think about some of the things that have happened in the last several years. Think about COVID. Think about the George Floyd riots. Think about transgender ideology. All of these various different huge social movements that have come into being over the last couple of years. And remember what these words are, that there are people out there who are specialists in creating patterns of thought and influence, shaping and molding the opinions of people and of the masses for desired ends. And it really shows you that the whole idea of what freedom is, because we hear so much about freedom in our society. America, is built around this idea of freedom. Every time a war happens, it's always justified by they are protecting our freedom. And we hear about it all the time. And yet, what does that word mean? What is freedom? Well, if you were to ask somebody on the street, if you were to just kind of, take a general poll, my impression is that most people would say, well, freedom means doing whatever you want. It means having the ability to do whatever you like, so long as you don't hurt anyone. Of course, everyone would always say that. So doing what you feel like doing, as long as you don't hurt anyone, that's basically what freedom is. But I would like to suggest to you that there is a real flaw in that definition of freedom. Because what if the thing that you want to do has in fact been put there by somebody who you don't even know, and they put it there so that they could manipulate you? Okay, and they could control you. Then is it freedom to do what you want to do? If that idea that has been put there so that you could be manipulated and controlled, obviously it would just be the most subtle form of slavery. It would not be freedom at all. Freedom, therefore, must have some external objective criterion. It must have some external objective standard by which we can judge it. And the classical understanding of freedom is that freedom means the ability to behave in a way that is in accordance with your nature. It means being unobstructed to behave in the way that you should behave. Okay. Now, that is obviously a very deep point that we could talk a lot about. The understanding of it that we see from the Greeks and Romans on down is that freedom means being able to be unhindered in any external compulsion by or coercion, but so that you can act in accordance with what your nature is. And human nature has certain qualities that are universal, right? Human nature is shared by all human beings by definition. What are some of those characteristics of human nature? Well, we are rational creatures, okay? We have reason, we have free will. And we can see among every single society that has ever existed, there are certain qualities that this reason and free will display themselves. So, for instance, every culture throughout all of history has always had some form of religion. That seems to be a total given of human nature. Okay, there has never been an organically atheistic society. Yes, of course, Soviet society is officially atheistic, has been, communist China, North Korea, and so on. But these were revolutionary governments that stamped out or tried to stamp out religion in those countries. They were not organic in the sense that those cultures before communism were atheistic. There never has been a society that doesn't have some belief in the divine, that doesn't have some belief in a soul and a life after death, and all of these kind of things that one associates with religion. So obviously the freedom to practice religion is built into human nature. Okay, and so to be free would be to have that unhindered. Okay, another aspect of human nature obviously is marriage. Okay, every society throughout all of human history has practiced marriage, meaning between a man and a woman. There has never been a society in which there was no concept of marriage. Okay, that was not simply something created by some cultures and not by others. It seems to be a given of human nature. Now, different cultures have had different ideas as to, if a man could have one wife or four, but there has never been a society where just a man could have anybody that he wanted, okay, and call it marriage. This is not how it works. So obviously, that is an aspect of human nature. Freedom in that case would imply the freedom to be married. And we could go on and on. There's all sorts of different qualities about this. And of course, under the influence of Christianity, the sort of classical Christian way of looking at this question of freedom would be to say that one is free if you have if external compulsion has been removed that would prevent you from acting in accordance with the way that your divinely constituted nature requires. So the freedom to worship the true God, the freedom to live in accordance with virtue, and to practice one's faith and to act morally, and to not be compelled to do immoral actions. This is how we are to understand freedom in a kind of classical Christian sense. Now, I leave all of that with you, though. The reason why I'm mentioning all of this is to suggest that classical Christian education, the classical ideal of education as it has filtered down throughout the ages in the West, gives us the mental toolkit to examine and to judge the propaganda that we are being fed on a constant basis. When people are well educated in the classical sense, that is, they have learned the laws of logic, they have learned the rules of reasoning, and they know how to use language effectively. They know how to understand when language is being used in a manipulative way. Then they are free because they can withstand the onslaught of propaganda. Okay, it is no accident that the modern day age there has been such a dumbing down of our general population. With the rise of propaganda, there has been a concomitant dumbing down of the masses. That is not by accident, because in a society, a population that is not trained to think logically and does not have external standards, absolute eternal standards for morality, can be very easily manipulated. Okay, can be led around by the nose because they through the arousal of subconscious desires, just as we saw in the Edward Bernays clip. Okay, now, so classical Christian education is the solution to the problem of the modern day age. Okay, it is the solution to the barbarism and degeneracy and vulgarity that we are being that is being foisted upon us ad nauseum. If we return to my point before the clip, to that noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, STEM enthusiasts, all, there are others who try to promote the idea that classics and the Greek and Latin languages do in fact serve a purpose, but it too is a purely utilitarian purpose. The Latin language, or the Greek language, for example, according to this camp, teaches us how to reason and instills a certain discipline, which can then be applied to any other task. So Latin is just like math in that regard. I personally cannot tell you how many times I have heard throughout my years as a Latin teacher this kind of argument. This noisy set defends Latin by granting it the merits of other branches of knowledge, while ignoring its own unique merits, without recognizing that Latin and Greek offer something that math cannot offer, just as math offers things that Latin and Greek cannot. Neither argument, therefore, that of the usefuls or that of the uselesses, is quite what engenders and nourishes a love for Latin, Greek, and the classics more generally. The objection given by the uselesses crowd, that is the crowd that sees the classics as useless, is just as weak as that of the usefuls, because Greek and Latin's purpose in this argument is to train the mind through its rich morphology for jogging the memory, its syntax for stimulating our logical deductive capacities, and so on. And all of that is no doubt true. It's all good. But if Latin and Greek alone do this alone, and that's it, then an exercise in learning them and in spending years and years learning them would be kind of equal to learning German and Russian and Arabic and Chinese or any other complex language, which also would have the added benefit that Latin and Greek do not have, of still being spoken by millions of people. Wouldn't algebra serve just as well to reinforce our memory and logical skills, or chemistry, or even a good mystery novel might do the trick? This is a frail argument, therefore, offered by this second camp, and it has for decades helped prop up shaky pedagogical and rhetorical methods, but it only has succeeded in adding fuel to the fire of the uselesses. The structure won't hold. The study of Latin and Greek and the classics, demanding, challenging, exhausting, and like a good hike through the mountains, restorative in and of itself, must not be treated simply as a cognitive boot camp. Yes, those things are good, okay? And as I said, the learning of logic and of reasoning skills, critical reasoning skills, is definitely a very important part of classical education. But I'm talking about the languages now in particular. And why we should study the classics, not just so that it could be useful. Otherwise, we would be next going to the Louvre or Metropolitan Museum of Art to sharpen our vision, or to La Scala Opera House in Italy to improve our hearing. Divers and ballerinas have beautiful physiques, no doubt, but they have built those muscles so that they can dive and dance, not to simply be healthy and be in good shape, to look at themselves in the mirror. When we study Latin, Greek, and classical literature, history, and philosophy, we must study it for one fundamental reason, because these are the languages, literature, history, and philosophy of a civilization, because the Western world was created in large part on this basis, and because inscribed in these languages and in the beautiful texts written in them are the secrets of our deepest cultural memory, secrets that demand to be read and that we forget at our own peril. Another contention against both the usefuls and the uselesses is that Latin, Greek, and the classics more generally are simply beautiful. And I want to connect this back with where I began this talk earlier. This fact of beauty undergirds all that I will be saying throughout this course. Beauty is the face of freedom. What all totalitarian regimes have most strikingly in common is their ugliness, which spreads to every aspect and form of their life, even to nature itself. Look at this picture I put in front of you. This is a typical Soviet block of apartments in, might as well be anywhere. I think it's from Russia, but it might as well have been from Ukraine or Belarus or Romania, Bulgaria, all these other places that lived under Soviet occupation. Ugliness, brutalist architecture. What all totalitarian regimes have most strikingly in common is this. And by the adjective beautiful, as its opposite, I mean to say that Latin and Greek are various, malleable, versatile, both easy and difficult at the same time, simple and complicated at the same time, regular and irregular, clear and obscure, with multiple registers and jargons, with thousands of rhetorical styles, and with a valuable history. Why give ourselves practical reasons for encountering beauty? Why impede ourselves with false arguments about comprehension? Why submit ourselves to the cult of instant access, of destination over journey, of answers at the click of a button, of the shrinking attention span? Why surrender to the will-less, the superficial, the defeatist, and the utilitarians? Why not see that behind the question, what's the point of classics, perhaps posed unassumingly, rests a violence and an arrogance an assault on the world's richness and the greatness of the human intellect. And I would also put you on guard against one more noxious cliche. Even among specialists, one hears the term dead language thrown around a lot when referring to Latin and ancient Greek. This characterization arises from a misconception of how languages live and die, and a hazy distinction between the written and the oral. Oral language is linked immediately with the idea of being alive in this assumption. But this is a bias. Latin and Greek, even if no longer spoken as a first language, are present in an astounding number of manuscripts, and writing, particularly written writing, is a far more durable means of communication than any oral practice. If, therefore, Latin and ancient Greek live on in the most complex form of writing ever imagined, namely literature, is it not absurd to proclaim them dead? Latin and ancient Greek are alive, and much more alive, I would say, than what we tell our friends at a cafe or our sweetheart on the phone in exchanges that leave no trace. Think of it on an even larger scale. At this present moment, the entire planet is jabbering, amassing an immeasurable heap of words. TikTok and Instagram are chattering away. Cardi B is vomiting something forth, no doubt, as we speak. And yet these words are already gone. Another heap has already formed, likewise destined to vanish in an instant. It is not enough, is it not enough, I should say, that the speakers are living to say that their language is alive? A living language is one that endures and produces other languages, which is precisely the case with ancient Greek and especially Latin. And here I am not just referring to the Romance languages, which were, of course, born from Latin, or to the massive contribution of Latin vocabulary to the English lexicon. What I mean to say is that Latin and Greek, as literature, have inspired the creation of other literature or other written works, and as such distinguish themselves from other ancient languages, those that even with a written record are truly dead on the page, or a clay tablet like Babylonian cuneiform or something like that. These languages have served in no way as a model for other languages. But yet, on the other hand, with Latin and Greek, Dante could never have composed his Divine Comedy without the model of the Aeneid, nor Milton, his Paradise Lost, nor Machiavelli could have written his discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, obviously without Livy, nor even Castiglione, his book of the courtier, without the paradigm of Cicero's De Oratore. Shakespeare, his rise would have been inconceivable without the influence of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And one could go on, filling hundreds of pages with such examples, coming from every age, even our current one, and from every cultural tradition on earth. Written Latin in the West eventually became the voice of the past, but this voice struck up a dialogue with posterity. There's no truer and more moving representation of this conversational power, I believe, than something that I would like to end our talk for today on. Machiavelli's letter to his friend Vittore. Machiavelli, as we all know, the great Renaissance political intriguer and professional sort of scoundrel, having been expelled from the world of politics, described the consolation he found in reading the ancients. But his reading in this letter became an exchange, a dialogue, a conversation, and it takes on the appearance of a real physical encounter. Here, the books stand in for the authors themselves, alive and well, despite their temporal remove, and his study becomes the magical space on an initiation ritual, as it were. In his own words, he says the following: "On the coming on of evening, I return to my house and enter my study, and at the door I take off the day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly, and reclothed appropriately I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for, where I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions. And they in their kindness answer me, and for 4 hours of time I do not feel boredom. I forget every trouble. I do not dread poverty. I am not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them. However unique Machiavelli's conversation appears to be, we all can do something similar when we approach a classical text. And this indeed is one of the whole purposes of education, to participate in the growth of tradition, to be a living part of it. Our very act of reading is not simply a private experience, but it posits itself within the overarching temporality of cultural transmission, which takes centuries to build, and it is what Western civilization has been. By reading the classics, and especially in the original languages, and by being informed by them, we are not just living today, we are living in history, transcending our own biographies, and entering a much broader chronology. The entire object of true education is to make people not merely do the right things, but to love the right things. Not merely to be industrious, but to love industry. Not merely to be learned, but to love knowledge. Not merely pure, but to love purity. Not merely just, but to hunger and thirst after justice. And it is precisely this sense that our culture can only continue to exist by retaining its memory of the classical past that ultimately sums up the whole point of this introductory lecture to our course. Thank you.